Hello there. It's January 3rd, 1885, a Saturday, and we're joining a ship's captain named Gilman E. Parker. And Captain Parker is a desperate man. He has been the master of a ship now for some time, a ship with somewhat of a tragic and mysterious history, and a ship that his fellow sailors, many of them anyway, believe to be cursed, the Mary Celeste. Now, I know most of you, if you've already clicked on this video and you're watching this, you probably already have an idea of what that name means, or at least when I tell you the name Mary Celeste, it does probably conjure up pictures of ghost ships in your head, whether you know the full backstory or not. And believe it or not, even as far back as 1885, even when Captain Parker was still the captain and sailing the Mary Celeste, even before she had gone below the waves, she had already developed a reputation for being a cursed ship. And in fact, the events that would lead to her gaining that reputation, the most famous parts of the Mary Celeste history, the thing that probably has made her known to you in the present, in 1885 was already a couple years in the past. And we'll get into that past, we'll get into the whole story. But for now, we're going to be a little unconventional and we're going to start at the end. Just know for now that on January 3rd in 1885, as we join Captain Parker, he is a desperate man, and it's partly because of this creepy history of his ship. He's had a hard time, as have had all the recent owners of the Mary Celeste and all of her captains, in getting crew and just getting stuff done on the ship. No one wanted to work on this ship anymore. No one wanted to work on the Mary Celeste. And the last few runs that she'd done, in fact, most of her previous runs for the past few years, had lost her company and her captain money. And the ship had changed hands in recent years many times, but each one of them had the same issue, and it only seemed to grow with time. Until now, when we join Captain Parker standing on the deck of his ship on a beautiful, clear Saturday morning, he's decided that he knows an answer to this problem. The cargo in her hold beneath him that day was basically worthless. It was miscellaneous bric-a-brac and partially just rotted fish and food. But he'd insured it for a princely sum of 25 grand and claimed on the forms that it contained a huge amount of very valuable, important supplies for his destination port. And in fact, if you go by the ship's manifest, his cargo held enough good, fresh food to feed all the people of Haiti for what's described as a long siege. Yeah, no. So you better believe that discrepancy wasn't by accident. And on Saturday, Captain Parker would direct his men to steer the Mary Celeste directly into a plainly visible coral reef just off the southern bank of Haiti. He would then urge all of his men into lifeboats and row away as the ship slowly sank beneath the waters, because he was done wasting time with this ship. And that damn ship was finally going to turn a profit for him. And if she had to do it from the bottom of the sea, then so be it. Now, there won't be any big twist endings here, so I'll let you know right now, Parker's plan didn't work. And it was partly just because he was too smart for his own good. Instead of letting the cargo just sink and collecting the faulty insurance money, instead he took the cargo with him, tried to get double shady, and sold it to the American consulate for $500. At which point, the American consulate realized they actually had lost money. And not only that, but then when he filed the faulty insurance claim, here was the stupid paper trail he'd left behind showing him selling this worthless cargo. And then checking it against that 25 grand insurance claim, it didn't work out. Parker would die only a few months later, completely destitute. One of his co-conspirators would end up committing suicide, and another reportedly went mad. And this all led some to speculate that even though she was now beneath the waves, the Mary Celeste may have claimed a few more victims. But here at this point, we need to stop and assess the situation, because oh my goodness, what a turn of events. It's one thing to have a hard time finding people to work in your business. It's another thing to set that business on fire, effectively. What is going on here? How did it come to this point? How did what appears to be a beautiful ship on paper and in painting end up being so hated and feared? How did a ship that was made by a small community of Nova Scotia farmers, essentially, end up being one of the most famous ghost ships in the history of the world? Well, there's a lot of different answers to that question, actually. And the mystery of the Mary Celeste has far outlived the history of the Mary Celeste. There's been theories and books and articles and radio plays and movies and short films and everything else you can possibly imagine about the mystery of the Mary Celeste. But what is the history behind the hype? What is the real truth behind the legends? That's actually complicated too. But I think it's worth hunting. Hello, my name is Marie, and welcome to Lost Realms. Each episode we look at a different city, place, or people that have been lost to us, whether through the destruction of a disaster, the ravages of climatic changes, the failure of governments, or the cruelty of neighbors. Each one of these wonderful places or people were taken from us forever. The Mary Celeste is one of the most famous ships to ever sail the seas, ghostly or otherwise. And I'm going to be really honest with you guys. I'm not going to try even to solve the mystery of the Mary Celeste in this episode. That's not really my point here. And I have to be very blunt with you all here. Even though I'm scared it'll make you click away, I don't much care about the mystery of the Mary Celeste. I say that respectfully. I do understand the appeal of the mystery part, and I do have a very good reason for wanting to do this story. And I promise, in the course of this episode, I will absolutely cover for you every aspect of the mystery, and I've hunted down some unique contemporary sources, though there's one in particular I'll be using. And actually, at this point, may I introduce to you one of my very dear friends. His name is James. This is James. Technically, he's from a bit of ways back too. He is one of those contemporary sources, and unfortunately, there's no surviving images left of him. But James is my just absolute best friend. And I hope that you'll consider him your friend too for the purposes of this episode. And I'll tell you that just like always, there is a full source list pinned to the top comment below. But if you look, though I do have different sources for geography and naval history and things like that, I'm not an expert or anything. James is going to be my primary and sole source for the history of the Mary Celeste herself. And I can't tell you why yet. And I can't tell you why I'm okay admitting in a video about the Mary Celeste that I don't really care about the mystery of the Mary Celeste. But I am going to admit to you, I do care very deeply about James. And James was not on the Mary Celeste. There's no big twist there. He was not on the Mary Celeste. He was not a passenger or crew member. He wasn't one of the owners of the ship. He wouldn't have been present at the trial. I don't even think he was alive yet. I'll have to check that. But he's a very good source. You don't have to trust me or anything, but for the next little while, just pretend to. And pretend to trust James. And I promise by the end, you'll understand absolutely everything. And despite everything I just said, I am really, really confident that you'll agree that James is the best source I could have ever used, despite his limitations, and that you understand why I say I don't care about the mystery part all that much. But anyway, with that disclosure given, and this introduction, very important introduction to our friend James made, let's get started. Mary Celeste has so many legends about her, it can be easy to forget that she didn't start out some sort of cursed ghost ship. And our good friend James has helpfully included her whole early history for us. But before that, I think it's helpful for us to stop and look at where the Mary Celeste came from. Though often mistakenly identified as a brig, the Mary Celeste was in fact a half-brig, which is a little bit smaller, and instead of having square sails on both masts, a half-brig would just have square sails on the front. And though she was built by Nova Scotian shipbuilders, which are somewhat famous today for their skill at seamanship, When she was first built, this wasn't the case. The first European settlers to come to Nova Scotia in the 16 and 1700s were French, and they were mostly farmers. After the French were deported by the English in 1755, the English needed to put some of their own people into this land, and they didn't really have enough people locally to do it. So in 1785, the governor of Nova Scotia at the time paid a bunch of British settlers from Nantucket, from Massachusetts, to come up to Nova Scotia and settle there as whalers. Now, these original Nantucket families that came to Nova Scotia were already working in the whaling business, and once they got to the province, they boomed. With its long coastline and easy access to marine resources, these whalers in Nova Scotia at the end of the 1700s were poised for success from the start. Many families began to grow and thrive in the province, but unfortunately in 1792, one of the main whaling firms in the province went under. And soon the whole whaling industry in Nova Scotia just collapsed. Now, what does any of this have to do with the Mary Celeste? Well, all of these New England whalers who had come to Nova Scotia with the promise of good business and making new lives for themselves suddenly found themselves out of work and extremely frustrated. Now, when the French had been in the province, they had done mostly farm work, like I said, and they had built rich farmlands by constructing dikes that are still in use in the area today to section off water coming in from the tides and to make more usable farmland. But part of the reason these New England whalers had stuck to whaling is that they didn't know how to construct or repair these dikes. So when the whaling business collapsed and Governor Parr now said, okay, well, why don't you take all this farmland that the Acadians had been using? The Nantucket whalers didn't really know what to do with that. And so all throughout the late 1700s and early 1800s, while some families still managed to be somewhat successful, most of the European inhabitants of Nova Scotia now living there were really struggling. But they had begun to notice that their family and friends back still down in New England were starting to make a name for themselves with shipbuilding. And slowly over time, some of these Nova Scotian residents that used to be whalers started thinking, hey, maybe we could do that. Meanwhile, let's leave Nova Scotia for a second, because our friend James has an exciting update for us. And that is that even though these Nova Scotian people were really struggling, not everyone in the early 1800s was having a horrible time. And actually back down in Massachusetts, like I said, things were going pretty well. And in particular, one family in 1835 had reason to celebrate. Because in the little village of Marion, Massachusetts, in that year, Captain Nathan Briggs and his wife Sophia gave birth to a son named Benjamin Briggs, or normally he seems to have gone by Benji. Now, the Briggs were an old shipping family, and the men of the family were old sea dogs for sure. The father, Nathan, had been at sea almost his whole life. His father had been too. And Benji, at a young age, would start going with his dad on board and soon seemed himself to be destined for a life at the sea. Nathan and Sophia would take Benji and the rest of their children, they had some 6 altogether throughout their marriage, and make a home for themselves at a place called Rose Cottage, not far from Marion. And theirs does seem to have been a loving family. And by 1855, our Benji, now 20 years old, was joining his dad proper working on these ships, specifically on a ship that his dad captained known as the Hope. He would travel with his dad over the next few years all over the world, from New York and London to the Chincha Islands in Peru. And our friend James tells us that he grew up to be a hardworking and reliable young man that valued both his work and his family very highly. And meanwhile, in 1860, when our friend Benji would have been around 25, back in Nova Scotia, a group of locals, James tells us, had gotten together with an idea. They were going to start their own shipbuilding yard there in Nova Scotia, using what they'd known from their whaling experience and from what their friends and family down in Massachusetts were doing. And in a little village called Spencer's Island, a group of dozens of community members would come together and chip in money and time and resources to build their first ship. Now, she was made with softwood and green, and it was their first go, but they put in all their effort and all their love. And even though she ended up being a half brig and not a full, and she came together pretty quick, at the end, by the time she was done in May of 1861, She was a gorgeous little ship. And not only that, she represented something beautiful to all these people. Like I said, they had all come together to pitch in to make this. The launch of the ship had pretty much everyone from the village show up. This was a labor of love, a team effort from everyone, and it meant hope for the future. Not only could they make money shipping cargo back and forth with this little ship, but once other people saw that they were building ships, I mean, demand was high. This one little ship could change their whole lives forever, and truly must have symbolized a brave, bold new future for this community. And they gave the ship an appropriately brave and bold name, the Amazon. Yeah, we're not quite to the Mary Celeste part yet. And though later legends would suggest that when she was launched into the water, she ran aground or other things, our friend James tells us no. She went beautifully into the water, actually. James even describes her as curtsying gracefully to her admiring onlookers. And by that same year, 1861, if we go back to our friend Benji in Massachusetts, well, again, he's not quite just in Massachusetts anymore. And by this point, he had most likely risen to ship's captain, because we know he got there around this time. And our Benji did well. He was master and commander of several ships in succession: the brig, the Seafoam, the schooner, the Forest King, and the barks known as the Prima Donna and the Arthur. And though I'm sure he was proud of these accomplishments, as I said, even from a young age, Benji seems to have been kind of a family man. And in 1862, he found a different thing to be proud of when he married the love of his life, a lady named Sarah Cobb. And I can confidently say the love of his life because our friend James tells us that theirs was an extremely happy marriage. Sarah was the daughter of a local Reverend Leander from Massachusetts. And James speaks very, very highly of her, remarking in particular that she always found the humorous side of everything. And she seems to have been really devoted to Benji and her whole new family with them. She would live with Benji and the rest of his family at Rose Cottage for many years. And she seems to have become really close, not with just Benji, but also his mom, which she referred to as Mother Briggs, who even when she was apart from, she seems to have had a warm correspondence with. And I bring up her being away from her husband's mom, even though they were apparently living together, because, well, like I said, Benji was kind of a family man. And right from the start, he didn't really want to leave Sarah at home. And she was very, very happy to come along. Soon, Sarah would start accompanying Benji on many of his different voyages. And perhaps unsurprisingly, they were soon welcoming their first child. In 1865, they would welcome a little beautiful boy named Arthur, who you can see here just being every single major kind of adorable. Look at that! Oh, wonderful little man. Oh, look at the wonderful little man. Who was just the apple of their eye. And I think they named him Arthur after the ship that Benji was captaining at the time, but I'm not sure. This was a happy time for the Briggs family as a whole. But unfortunately, for our friend the Amazon / Mary Celeste, things weren't going quite so well. Her first captain, fresh out of Nova Scotia, had died only after a few days at sea. And well, for a few years, she was a functioning vessel, and things seemed to go smoothly. It didn't stay that way. By 1867, or when our little Arthur had been about 2 years old, our glorious little ship, the Amazon, was wrecked off Cape Breton Island, off the northern tip of Nova Scotia. Now, I put wrecked in quotation marks because the captain of our ship had just been fired before this. He ignored this and took the ship out and accidentally wrecked her immediately afterwards. And she was described as being in such a rough shape that the local Nova Scotians that had built her couldn't afford to salvage her. They had to sell her. But interestingly, despite this, she is registered, which means that she would be thought of as seaworthy, with a new owner less than a week later. Now, this all seems very shady, and in fact, our friend James seems to think that this may have been a way of basically stealing the Amazon, of stealing the ship. Though this can't be proven, it means that the people of Nova Scotia, the farmers and everyone that had chipped together to make this ship of hope, had lost her. And that was it. She wasn't going to keep making money for them. And now they were in the hole. She would be described later on as the ship that made them eat from tin spoons. That brave, bold future we talked about had instead become this grim, cold, lonely reality. And though I'm sure the Amazon's new acquirers had very high hopes for her future, in the end, they seemed to struggle. And in fact, she would change hands a couple times over the next couple years and eventually be registered as an American vessel, at which point she would get the name Mary Celeste. But by this point, she had already started to develop a reputation. And actually, just to make it clear, it's always been Mary with this spelling. If you see it with Mary with this spelling, based on an Arthur Conan Doyle story, basically, it's long, just don't worry about it. But none of her new owners, as she would change hands, seemed to be able to make any money on her. And throughout her history at this point, there's lots of allegations of shadiness and wrongdoing from different owners and captains, though nothing disastrous or ominous necessarily, just what my dad would call greasy stuff. But she would also be refitted with new sails and lots of actually different additions throughout this period, and she should be thought of still as a ship in good shape. And the ship, again now known as our proper name, the Mary Celeste, does seem to have been well taken care of by her captain at this time, towards the end of the 1860s, a captain named Winchester. However, frankly, he was bleeding money, and he couldn't afford to keep up with her anymore. And meanwhile, our family of Benji and Sarah and Arthur were also facing some challenges. Every family experiences pain, even the happiest and nicest of them. And while Arthur was a happy and healthy young boy, in 1869, Sarah would give birth to their second child, also a son, named Everson. Unfortunately, Everson did not thrive quite so well, and only 9 months after his birth, he unfortunately passed away. Though I don't have a lot from James about this, I do know it was incredibly painful for our little family. And so in 1870, when Sarah became pregnant for a third time, they must have felt so much hope. And this time, it worked out. They gave birth to a beautiful little girl, their first daughter, named Sophia, who was born at the family home of the Rose Cottage. And our little family was just about beside themselves. And by this point, Benji, who was only in his mid-30s, had already been at sea for well over a decade and a captain of several vessels. And though he loved what he did, he also really loved just spending time with his wife and now his 2 children. He, along with his brother Oliver, started to look for jobs on land. He even around 1871 started to plan with his brother to purchase a hardware store on land so he could spend more time at home. But their father had recently had a bad financial venture. I don't know a lot of details about it, but James tells me that it made Benji and his brother nervous to invest in anything at that time. And like I said, Sarah and Arthur and now Sophia could come with Benji sometimes aboard ship, so that must have made it a little better. And in 1872, they got some brilliant news. Sarah was pregnant for her 4th time, and that same year, beautiful little Edith Percy Briggs would be born. But horribly, only 2 months after her birth, she would unfortunately pass away, leaving our family devastated all over again. And despite us thinking of the 1800s as being kind of a casual time for child mortality, it's clear the loss of these children affected them deeply. And Benji again started looking for ways that he could try to make things more stable for his family. And around this time, he heard from a captain he knew about a ship that was looking for new investors. A half-brig, smaller than his most recent ships, so maybe not as long travels away from home. This ship was having repairs done a lot recently. Benji could refit the cabin to be a proper family home for Sarah and the kids. With him being part owner, if he did that, then that's totally within his rights. It wasn't as good as going to land, but it was the next best thing. And Benji leapt at the chance to buy a share in this ship, the Mary Celeste, from Captain Winchester in 1872. And Benji immediately set to refitting the cabin, as I described, to make it homey for Sarah and Sophie and Arthur. Although Arthur was just getting to the age where he had to be in school, young man, and education is important. And it's clear that that was very much on Benji's mind too. And as I said, a lot of people in the Briggs family stayed at the Rose Cottage, not just Benji and his wife and kids. Benji's mom, Mother Briggs, was still there. And so, as our Benji geared up to go to sea in the Mary Celeste for the first time, he would be taking Sarah, he would be taking Sophie, but schooling for Arthur was really important to him. And he thought too, maybe his mom might get a little lonely. And so, as the Mary Celeste was getting adjustments and preparing for loading, and prepared for her first voyage with him as captain, he made the tough choice to leave Arthur at Rose Cottage with Mother Briggs. Though it's clear that this was an incredibly painful decision for him at the time, and I think for Sarah too. And both Benji and Sarah would send letters back and forth with Mother Briggs and even Arthur in the days that preceded, in the weeks leading up to the ship being ready to launch again. Some of these letters survive and were helpfully shared by our friend James.
My dear mother, it has been a long time since I've written you a letter, and I should like to give you a real interesting one. But I hardly know what to say, except that I am well, and the rest of us ditto. It is such a long time since I composed other than business epistles. It seems to me to have been a great while since I left home. But it is only over 2 weeks. But in that time, my mind has been filled with business cares, and I am again launched away into the busy whirl of business life, from which I have so long been laid aside. For a few days, it was tedious, perplexing, and very tiresome, but now I have got fairly settled down to it, and it sets lightly and seems to run more smoothly, and my appetite keeps good, and I hope I shan't lose any flesh. It seems real homelike since Sarah and Sophia got here, and we enjoy our little quarters. On Thursday, we had a call from Willis and his wife. Took Sophia and went with them on a ride up to Central Park. Sophia behaved splendid and seemed to enjoy the ride as much as any of us. It is the only time they have been away from the vessel. On account of the horse disease, the horse cars have not been running on this side of the city, so we have not been able to go out and make any calls, as we were so far away from anyone to go on foot. And to hire a private carriage would be at least $10 a trip, which we didn't feel able to pay, and we couldn't carry Sophia and walk a mile or two, which we should have had to do to get a ferry for Ivamax or Eport. It's been very confining for us, but when we get back I hope we can make up for it. We seem to have a very good mate and steward, and I hope I shall have a pleasant voyage. We both have missed Arthur, and I believe we should have sent for him if I could have thought of a good place to stow him away. Sophia calls for him occasionally and wants to see him in the album, which, by the way, is a favorite book of hers. She knows your picture in both albums and points and says, "Gamma biz." She seems real smart and has gotten over her bad cold she had when she came, and has a first-rate appetite for hash and bread and butter. I think the voyage will do her lots of good. We enjoy our melodeon and have some good sings. I was in hopes that Ollie might get in before I left, but I'm afraid not now. We finished loading last night, and shall leave on Tuesday morning if we don't get off tomorrow night, the Lord willing. Our vessel is in beautiful trim, and I hope we shall have a fine passage, but I have never been in her before and can't say how she'll sail. She'll want to write us in about 20 days to Genoa, care of the American consul, and about 20 days after to Messina, care of American consul, who will forward it to us if we don't go there. I wrote to James to pay you and A's board and rent. If he forgets, call on him also for any money that may be necessary for clothes. Please get even to see his skates are all right, and the holes in his new thick boot heels. I hope he'll keep well, as I think if he does, there'll be some help as well as some company for you. Love to Hannah. Sophie calls Aunt Hannah often. I wish I had a picture, so she could remember the countenance as well as the name. Hoping to be with you in the spring. With much love, I am yours affectionately, Benj.
So often when we think of the 1800s, we think of sort of formalized speech, and that's often what we see and hear when we delve into that part of history. And I just have to stop for a minute and congratulate Captain Benjamin Briggs, Benji, for being so human, even from so far away. And as I hinted at earlier, our James has assured me that Benji was not the only one writing letters at this time. In fact, in a letter dated only a few days before this, Sarah also wrote to Mother Briggs, giving her own account of her first glimpses of the Mary Celeste and little Sophie's love of a new friend that she made there. Now, before I begin, Sarah has a bit of a tendency to sometimes refer to herself in the third person, as well as Benji. I think it's partly because she's intending for these letters to be read aloud to her son, Arthur, who's still quite little. But just keep in mind, if you hear her use the term mother, she's referring to herself, or father, then she's referring to Benji. Quote,
"Well, Sophie and I got here all right this morning, and Father met us at the boat and brought us over to his vessel, which is the brig Mary Celeste. Little Sophie was interested in the ship's cat that was tied up down below so it could not run away, and kept crying to get out. Sophie called her Poo-uh Poo. She was very much delighted to see Sarah Jane and Daisy, her dolls, when we gave them to her. After a while, Mother was playing on the melodeon, and she wanted Sarah Jane to play too, so Mother took her to teach her. Finding that it was her right arm that was broken, and not wishing her to play left-handed, Mother turned her around back too, and she played quite as well as if she'd faced the music. Afterwards, Father made Daisy play two parts with her 2 feet, so that Sophie seemed quite proud of her 2 children. She has got them cuddled up in bed with her now, and they're all fast asleep."
end quote. In fact, Sarah seems to have kept up quite a lively correspondence, and oftentimes skipping Mother Briggs entirely and sending letters directly to Arthur himself. In these letters, her humor does shine through, and not only that, but her deep love for her son. And in one of these letters, she praises him for going to church with his grandma and Uncle James, and for helping to look after his grandma. It's a very good thing for him to collect milk for grandma, and if he gets scared of the dark, then don't worry, and to remember his scripture. Quote,
"Tell both grandmas I shall write to them very soon. Try to get plenty of wood in for Grandma Briggs, because you are the man of the house now, you know. When you write again, tell how you have got along in arithmetic and spelling, and if you have learned to skate. If Grandmother hasn't gotten any other bedtime for you, I think you had better go to bed every night at 7:30, so as to feel bright in the morning. Sophie has put a kiss for Arthur right here on the paper, so you will know it's there, if you can't see it. Mother wants you to go to the graves of your little brother and sister sometimes, with Grandmother."
end quote. And here again, I have to stop and just admire the people in this family. She's encouraging her son as best she knows how. She's giving him lots of love, also from Sophie. And she's also still showing love for her children that have passed, but not in a morbid way. I kind of really like how she phrases that. You should go visit your little brother and sister sometime. Sarah is also going to be the writer of the last ever letter to emerge from any person aboard the Mary Celeste. Because those last few letters I read to you were the days leading up to, as I mentioned before, the Mary Celeste's first launch with Briggs as captain. And on Monday, November 4th, now that the modifications to the ship and the loading of its newest cargo was completed, they were ready to set off. However, their initial departure from port was a little rough, though not dangerous. They ended up waylaid there a little while, and it's from this strange sort of liminal space that we get our last letter from Sarah. Addressed to Mother Briggs on November 7th, literally addressed from the brig Mary Celeste off Staten Island. Quote,
"Dear Mother Briggs, probably you will be a little surprised to receive a letter with this date. But instead of proceeding to sea when we came out Tuesday morning, we anchored about a mile or so from the city, and Ben said it looked so thick and nasty ahead we shouldn't gain much if we were beating and banging about. Accordingly, we took a fresh departure this morning, with wind light but favorable, so we hope to get outside without being obliged to anchor. Benji thinks we have got a pretty peaceable set this time all around, if they continue as they have begun. Can't tell yet how smart they are. B reports a good breeze now, says we are going along nicely. As I have nothing more to say, I will follow A Ward's advice and say it once. Farewell. Yours affectionately, Sarah.
End quote. Everything that happens from this point on has become the subject of much scrutiny. Now, the nature of the cargo of the Mary Celeste was alcohol. To be more specific, because you'll sometimes see people even try to claim it's denatured spirits or methanol. No. This specifically was alcohol or spirits being exported for use in fortifying wine. And the Mary Celeste was carrying 1,701 barrels of it, just to be extremely specific. But as the Mary Celeste finally went out to sea carrying her cargo, at first it has to be noted that everything seemed to go fine, at least from what we know. She sailed with fair wind from New York and made good time until she got to the Azore Islands. On November 25th, according to the ship's log, they were getting extremely favorable winds and making 8 knots. And our Benji kept good ship's logs, and they're meticulous up until the point of 8 o'clock the following morning. Now we know by this point the weather had gotten rainy and the wind had started to turn against them. But that is where the ship's logs end. And this is where the real mystery of the Mary Celeste comes into play. Because after this point, at roughly 8 o'clock in the morning, something happened. What? We don't know. But whatever happened after 8 o'clock in the morning caused everything to change. And you may think of this point in the story as being the end of all normalcy. And also, unfortunately, the end of our dear beautiful family. And after the notes in Benji's ship logs, we know nothing from them directly. And with those last words, our beautiful little family left our past and entered our mythology. Eight days after that last log was written on the Mary Celeste, a different ship, the De Gracia, also a brig, sailing from New York with a cargo of petroleum, came across the Mary Celeste on her way to Gibraltar. This ship was around the same size as the Mary Celeste, but had set out much later from New York, and was moving a little slower. The captain of this ship, Captain Morehouse, saw the Mary Celeste drifting from a distance. He and his first mate Oliver DeVoe watched it through a spyglass for some time. They eventually came up close to it and hailed the vessel, but received no response. And eventually first mate Oliver and 2 other men would board the vessel, trying to figure out what the heck was going on. The first thing he did, like any good sailor, was to sound the pumps, basically to make sure the water pumps were still working in the ship. And he found them to be in good order, though one was disassembled. Once this detail was out of the way and he knew he wasn't in danger of suddenly sinking, first mate Oliver was forced to notice the eerie silence around him, and it soon became clear that the Mary Celeste was empty. All 10 of her occupants and Poo-uh Poo were gone, and the ship herself seemed seaworthy, as I said. There was about 3.5 feet of water in the hull, but to be honest, that's fairly normal for a ship at that time. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't strangeness. The hatch, the main hatch to below, to the cargo, was awkwardly placed and not sitting right. Everything in the cabin was wet, and there had been a great deal of water in there. The skylight of the cabin was open and raised. The compass had been destroyed. All of the captain's personal belongings were still there. His clothing, furniture. The logbook was in the mate's cabin in his desk. And the log slate was found on the cabin table. It really seemed to first mate Oliver like everyone had just left in a huge hurry. Everything was basically in place, but just kind of sort of jittered around like someone had been going through stuff quickly. And first mate Oliver noticed an impression in the bed of the captain, but in the shape of a child, almost certainly Sophie. The hull of the ship was undamaged, appearing basically new. The masts were good, the spars were good, but the rigging was in very bad order. Some of it was just carried away and gone. There were no lifeboats left aboard. And all of this absolutely confused First Mate Oliver, Captain Morehouse, and just everyone there. It also left them a little bit confused as to what to do. Finally, they resolved amongst themselves to tow the boat back with them to port, to Gibraltar. This was something of a dangerous undertaking, but they did pull it off. And once they got to port, they were, within a couple of days, called to testify as to what had happened and what was going on. Some believed them, Some frankly didn't and suspected foul play, either from the crew of the DeGracia or from perhaps pirates. Basically, at this point, people were wondering what had happened to the captain, his family, and his crew. Our Benji was 37 at the time of this incident, which I think in modern terms would make him seem like kind of a young captain. But in his day, remember, they knew he was an experienced sailor. They knew he was an experienced ship commander. He had some salt in the game. And while certainly a ship being abandoned wasn't unheard of back then, there was normally a clear reason why. The Mary Celeste was in good enough shape they were able to sail it back to port. And once this investigation began and divers inspected the ship further, they all agreed she was in perfectly seaworthy condition. So why would Benji make everyone abandon it? There was no evidence of collision or accident. Rumors of blood being spotted on the captain's sword or on deck were later disproven, and upon checking the cargo, it was all there except for 9 barrels of the alcohol, which were empty. But frankly, the type of wood those barrels were made of, like those 9 barrels were made of a different type of wood than the rest of the barrels, and so that kind of basically liquor shrinkage was normal. By process of elimination, they eventually ruled out mutiny because the voyage wasn't even that long. And again, there's no evidence that they were getting drunk or there were any problems or anything aboard. The crew and the captain might not have known each other well, but they all seem to have gotten along as far as we know. And pirates? Why didn't they take the cargo with them? And in the end, the investigative reports, which there were multiple of them, were forced to conclude they didn't really know what happened, but there was no evidence of foul play. Something that not everyone agreed with completely at the time. This was still a contentious topic though, and the DeGracia and her crew, they were awarded a salvage reward, but much, much less than the Mary Celeste was actually worth. And it's been implied that this may be because some people still weren't convinced that the crew of the DeGracia wasn't involved. And from that point on, the Mary Celeste, still seaworthy, would bounce between hands and owners and things, basically perpetually losing money. Her reputation as a ghost ship now solidified, until eventually we get back to where we started our story. And a desperate man making a desperate move that of course goes desperately wrong. Since all this happened so many years ago, there have been so many theories put forward as to why Benjamin Briggs, the captain, our Benji, made his crew and family leave the Mary Celeste. Water spouts, sea quakes, and even giant squid attack have all been put forward as ideas of natural phenomenon that could have disrupted the Mary Celeste or could have led Briggs wanting to abandon ship. I will say on the sea quake thing, this was investigated in the 1940s, and it was found that there was no evidence of an earthquake happening at that time in the water near there. And in fact, the Meteorological Center in the Azores actually looked into it and sent a letter to an author, Charles Fay, that was writing a book on this. Excellent book, by the way. And you're seeing a transcription of it from the site maryceleste.net here. So the sea quake theory, even though it's interesting, seems very unlikely. Water spout, maybe. It's kind of hard to say either way. One of the theories I like most that has been put forward in different versions over time, but perhaps most famously by Charles Fay and a couple others, was that since the ship was carrying a cargo of alcohol held down below, fumes would rise up and need to be ventilated from the lower hatch, from the cargo hold. Now the captain would have known this. What he may not have known is that when moving from the colder temperatures of New York to just off the Azores, the change of air temperature may have made that buildup of fumes happen faster. And in general, I should say that our Benji wasn't really used to transporting alcohol. He knew it had to be ventilated. He might not have known how often, is I guess what I'm getting at. Again, the hatch to the cargo hold was all ajar and weird when they discovered the ship. Now, if those fumes had built up and someone tried to rip open that hatch to ventilate it, the pressure may have caused like a big boom or an explosion-y sound. Now, in those exact circumstances, it probably wouldn't have done any serious damage to the ship, but the captain might not know that. And a sounding rod was found on deck, which is basically a rod used to tell how much water the ship is taking on. So we know they were checking to see if they were sinking. And though the ship wasn't sinking, if there's these booming sounds going on below deck, and even though the hull didn't have a dangerous amount of water yet, it still did have some water, maybe this would cause Benji to put everyone in the lifeboats. And then if the weather turned, which we know both from the ship's logs right before all this happened, And actually later on, the DeGracia too would confirm rough weather. And that could cause the lifeboat's line to the ship to snap. And unfortunately, in all of our theories, they kind of end the same way. Whether it was sea quakes or water spout or anything, it ended up with our people, our wonderful people, not being here anymore. Now, if that's because the lifeboat took them out to sea and we never found them, if the lifeboat capsized and all of them, Benji, Sarah, Sophie, drowned, I'm gonna be honest, I don't really know. Touchingly, Sophie had left her dolls behind, but not the cat. Like I said, the cat wasn't found there either. And while some have argued maybe in the end they chose not to take the cat aboard, we have no reason to think so. And Arthur, who already had lost a little brother and sister, now lost basically everyone close to him. His grandmother would attempt to shield him from everything going on in the next few years, but how could she? And, you know, it's a lot for a grandma to look after a little boy like that. So Arthur ended up going to live with his uncle and his 5 children. And it was a happy home, and they loved Arthur. I want to tell you that now, he did. He had a loving family still. And while he never had any children of his own, he did live a full life and get married. And I think he worked as a bookkeeper, actually. But the Briggs as a whole never really got their peace after. I told you that our Benji was one of 6 children. Well, all of them, except for one, would die before the age of 50. And in fact, the only account I can find of Benji's brother, Oliver, the one he was going to buy the hardware store with, yeah, the only account I can find of his death has him dying in a shipwreck too. Kind of awfully, actually, but that's just from a find a grave member. I don't really know. But all of them I do know, unfortunately, didn't live very long. Except for one, JC, a brother of Benji. He made the somewhat understandable decision to take a life away from the sea. He worked for a maritime supply company. He lived until 1922, and he never forgot what happened to his brothers, or his niece, or his sister-in-law, or their whole family. It really, understandably, kind of destroyed them. But JC never stopped talking about it. He told his friends about it. He talked with the rest of the family about it. And when he had kids, he told them all about it, and how important it was, and how amazing Benji was, and how amazing Sarah was, and how amazing Sophie, little adorable troublemaker Sophie was. And it's a good thing that he did, because in the years that followed, oh my goodness, everyone was talking about mutiny, or maybe even our good Benji, yeah, maybe it was all insurance fraud. Yeah, maybe Benji abandoned Arthur. Maybe Benji was just awful. Maybe Sarah was just awful. Maybe they're all just awful. And in fact, in the 1930s, Hammer Studios would make a movie about the Mary Celeste. And they didn't make Briggs the bad guy. But him and Sarah, yeah, I guess they hooked up because Benji stole his friend's girl. Yeah, that sounds like him. Now, thankfully, Arthur and Benji's brother JC had both passed away by this point, so they didn't have to see that garbage. But his kids would. His kids, after growing up watching the wreckage of all this, would have to see this in their movie theaters, and one of them eventually had enough. One of JC's sons, one of Benji's nephews, just had enough of all of it, understandably. He was tired of all this. And so he decided in 1944 to sit down and write an account. Not a proper book, an account, a statement for his family to set the record straight. And he just didn't rely on sources from within the family. No, he interviewed literally everyone he could think of. The captain that Benji had bought his shares of the ship from, the crew of the DeGracia, people involved in the investigations, everyone he could think of, different authors, Charles Fay. He interviewed him. He interviewed every single person he could find. Until finally he felt he had the info he needed. Until finally he had a complete and proper account. And I'm very proud to say, in 1944, our good friend, James Franklin Briggs, published his story entitled In the Wake of the Mary Celeste. In it, he shares all the technical details of the ship, her history, her owners. He includes all the information he's been able to gather from all those sources I just listed to you. And he makes it clear that he understands. He understands the allure. He understands the mystery. He understands that it captivates. But it's also from him that I have the letters that I've read to you. It's also from him that I know that the cat was called Poo-uh Poo. It's from him that I know that Sarah saw the funny side of everything. It's from him that I know that Benjamin was missing his son so much. It's from him that I know that Benjamin Briggs was not only a damn fine ship's captain, but made the time to apparently help his daughter play piano with her dolls. And I think it's the only source that I really care about, because it's true. At the end of the day, whether it was aliens or mutineers or anything else, it all just ends the same way. It all just ends. And the longer that we hold on to the mystery of the Mary Celeste, the longer that greedy, awful people out there will be okay turning the sweet, talented, hardworking Benjamin Briggs into a lady stealer, or worse, a fraud. And there have been so many sensationalized articles about the Mary Celeste, so much just kind of crap, that even the monument erected to the memory of the Mary Celeste is wrong. Now, I should say this monument was put together in the 1970s, so many years after the fact, and was actually funded by a historical society. It's a wonderful gesture. It's very kind. But it perpetuates some of the myths that I shared with you earlier along the way here. The mystery of the Mary Celeste has now completely overshadowed the history of the Mary Celeste. And I feel like we just gotta let her go. Not the history. This is a very pro-history channel. You'll never see me hate on wanting to learn about history here. But the mystery of the Mary Celeste. I told you all to start. I really don't give a damn about the mystery of that rotten old ship. And it doesn't matter what theory is your preference, because it doesn't matter. They all end the same way. And I still don't get Sophie. I still don't get Sarah. I still don't get any of them. Well, and I guess I wouldn't, because it was the 1800s, and I don't mean to be overdramatic. And I know that people will accuse me of being overdramatic and overly sentimental. This isn't me trying to cancel the Mary Celeste, or I don't know. I don't know how to end this one. But I guess what I'm saying is I truly don't care about the Mary Celeste and her mysterious departure at all, because after this many years, we're never going to know. I wish I knew where Benji was. I wish I knew where Sarah was. I wish I knew where Sophie was. And I wish I could tell you as much detail about the rest of the crew as I could about them. I'm not picking favorites. I just can't find anything. Because the mystery of the Mary Celeste has truly drowned out the history of the Mary Celeste. We need to let the Mary Celeste go. And even if you think that I'm being just a sentimental old biddy, and I might agree with you, even still, because it will allow you to show kindness to the dead and to a sentimental old biddy, and it will cost you absolutely nothing. If you're ever sitting with a group of friends and someone asks you, hey, you ever hear about the ghost ship Mary Celeste, or oh, the mystery of the Mary Celeste, isn't that cool? Isn't that crazy? Please consider respectfully saying, I really don't care about the mystery of the Mary Celeste. Did you ever hear of the Briggs family? And their whole crew? They seem really cool. Seem like really nice people. And the stars always come out in the end. And that means it's both the end of my story and the end of our time here today. And thank you so much for being here for the story of the banished family of the Mary Celeste. Whenever we dive into the crazy world of our history, we can see things that confuse us or upset us or even make us angry. But if we're feeling anything about our history, then I think that means it matters to us, and I think that that's beautiful. And when I said thank you earlier, I hope you know it wasn't just for your views, but for your compassion, your empathy, and your humanity. Because if you have an interest in our human history, then that means that you do have all these qualities, and I'm very happy that you do. If you find yourself particularly interested in our topic today, then please don't let my words be the only words you hear on the Mary Celeste. I strongly recommend a certain friend's book that you'll find in the sources below. But please don't stop there. And your local library might have a real cool book on nautical history, or just on something else weird. It doesn't have to be history related. It doesn't have to be anything related. Sometimes I just walk on in there and I just start grabbing stuff. Not people. Never people. Just go to the library. And once you're back from the library, keep an eye out for this week's Lost Bits, which is every Saturday. And it's the place where I share interesting bits of information I find while making these main episodes. It's also just a place for me to get to know you guys better. So if you have any comments or questions you want addressed in Lost Bits, then make sure you let me know below. And I always just love to hear from you. Hopefully I'll see you soon. But either way, thank you again so much for being here. Be safe, be happy, go with all my love. Until next time, goodbye.